everyone. Today we're going to be continuing A Hope No More Powerful Than the Sea, and we are on now chapter 2, which is The War Begins. It all started with some graffiti spray painted on a wall by a group of schoolboys. In February 2011, and for months, the people of Daraa had watched as repressive regimes throughout the Middle East were challenged and brought down. In Tunisia, disenfranchised youths, identifying with Mohamed Bouazizi's despair, set cars on fire and smashed shop windows in their frustration and desperation. In response, the hardline Tunisian president, Zine El Abidine Ben Ali, who had been in power since 1987, promised his people more employment opportunities and freedom of the press, and said that he would step down when his term ended in 2014. However, his announcements did little to assuage the public. Riots erupted all over the country, demanding the president's immediate resignation. Ben Ali responded by declaring a state of emergency and by dissolving the government. His hold on the country weakened, and his ring of supporters in the army and the government turned against him. On January 14th, less than a month after Mohamed Bouazizi set fire to himself, the president resigned from office and fled to Saudi Arabia with his family. For the first time ever in the Arab region, a popular protest had succeeded in bringing down a dictator. In Syria, families such as Doa's watched in amazement. No one imagined they would ever defy the Syrian regime. Everyone disliked some things about the government: the ongoing emergency law, worsening economic conditions, the lack of freedom of speech, but people had all learned to live with them. Everyone felt that nothing could be done. An all-seeing security apparatus reached into every neighborhood and kept an eye on troublemakers. Activists in Damascus, who had demanded reforms after the death of the former president Hafez al-Assad, had landed in prison, which had intimidated people from speaking ill of the regime, much less making demands until now. The uprising in Tunisia made it seem to ordinary Syrians that anything was possible. Doa, now 16, and her sisters began to press their parents for details about what was happening in the region, wondering whether it could happen in Syria as well. Their father tamped down their enthusiasm, afraid to encourage them. Syria was different than Tunisia, he had told them. Their government was stable. What happened in Tunisia was a one-time thing, or so he thought. Then came Egypt, then Libya, and Yemen. In each country, protests followed a different script, but all of them called for the same thing: freedom. One man's desperate act to protest had ignited flames of revolt across the Middle East. The Arab Spring was born, stirring hope in the discontented, especially the youth, and fear in those who ruled them. When uprising swept over Egypt, Syrians took particular notice. The two countries had merged for a brief 3-year period in 1958 into the United Arab Republic. Syria had seceded from the Union in 1961, but cultural ties remained strong. So when the Egyptian government, Hosni Mubarak, was forced to step down February 11th, 2011, many disgruntled Syrians celebrated the victory of his toppling as if it were their own leader. Doa and her family watched the television reports in awe as thousands of demonstrators in Tahrir Square in Cairo erupted with joyous celebrations. In Cairo erupted with joyous celebrations. They cheered along with chants: Allah Akbar, God is great. Misr, Egypt is free, streaming on the TV screens. Daraa had always been considered a reliable base of support for the President Assad and his Ba'ath party. But after Mukbar's fall, it hushed discussions. Citizens of Daraa started to talk about their own oppressive regime. Who would dare confront the Syrian government, they wondered. So what's happening is lots of the governments in the Middle East are dictators, and the people are not happy with who is in leadership because they take away their right to speak, freedom of speech. They take away their rights in general. They arrest people without any reason. They don't let them out of jail unless there's bribes given or the right people. So there's a lot of bad things happening with the government. The people were afraid to fight against the government because they would just kill or they would just arrest. But now that they're starting to see that other countries have broken down their governments, Syria is trying to think of how they can do the same. Assad was known for meeting dissent with crushing violence. Maybe ordinary people rising up against an all-powerful system could change things in other countries, but not in Syria, they felt for sure. The 3 dots, ... A group of defiant young boys on the cusp of puberty would be the first descendants to gain attention in Syria. On a quiet night in February 2011, inspired by the rallying cries that dominated the Arab Spring, they spray-painted graffiti on their school wall. Ejak al-Dur ya Doktor, your next doctor, alluding to Bashar al-Assad's training as an ophthalmologist. After they finished, the boys ran home laughing and joking, excited by what they saw as a harmless prank, a minor act of defiance. They knew the graffiti might anger the security forces, but they never imagined their small action would provoke a revolution of Syria's own to lead a civil war that would divide and destroy the country. Isn't that incredible? One small cause can have such a great effect. The next morning, the headmaster of the school discovered the graffiti and called the police to investigate. One by one, 15 boys were rounded up and taken off for interrogation to the local office of the Political Security Directorate, the arm of the Syrian intelligence apparatus that tightly monitors internal dissent, which means the people turning against the government internally. They were then transferred to Daraa, to one of the most feared intelligence detention centers in Damascus. Doa's family knew some of the boys and their relatives. Almost everybody did. In a close-knit city of Daraa, everyone was connected somehow, either through marriage or community. No one was sure of those rounded up, if any, had actually sprayed the graffiti. Some boys were pressed to confess or implicate friends. Others were interrogated because their names had been scribed on the walls long before the graffiti was painted. No one could believe that these kids had been arrested for such a minor act. About 1 week later, the families of the boys visited Ataf Najib, a cousin of President Assad's and the head of the local political intelligence branch, to appeal their release. According to unconfirmed accounts that became legend, Najib told the parents that they should have taught their children better manners. He allegedly mocked the men, saying, "My advice is that you forget you ever had these children." Oh my gosh. So these boys are probably 12, 13 years old and most likely didn't even do it. And this man is telling them to forget that their child ever existed. This was the final insult of the people of Daraa. On March 18th, protesters took the streets, demanding the release of the boys. This came 3 days after hundreds of people staged a rare protest in the old city of Damascus, calling for democratic reforms and an end to emergency laws, and the release of the political prisoners. They chanted, "Peacefully, peacefully," as they marched to announce the nature of their movement. 6 protesters were allegedly detained that day. On March 18th, in a coordinated action, people in Damascus, Homs, and Banyas also took to the streets along with the people of Daraa to demand the release of Daraa's children while chanting, "God, Syria, freedom! God, Syria, freedom!" Doa stood outside her home and watched the protesters marching and shouting, "End the emergency law," and demanding the release of the political prisoners, including the boys of Daraa. She stood at the edge of the sidewalk just outside of her front door as protesters passed right in front of her, so close that she could have reached out and touched them. The emergency and promise of the demonstration exhilarated her. Her whole life, she had been told that people of Syria would never defy their government and that she had to accept things as they were. But as she stood there watching the demonstrators file past her, for a moment, she felt the urge to step off the sidewalk and join them, to be a part of what would be a new Syria. Suddenly, to her surprise, the police began to fire tear gas at the protesters and blast them with high-pressure water cannons from advancing big trucks. Her excitement turned to horror as protesters ran, screaming in all directions, or fell helpless to the ground. The street in front of her home had, in an instant, turned into a site of confrontation. Horrified, she fled to the safety of the house. Later that day, outside the Al-Amari Mosque in the center of town, demonstrators gathered and staged a sit-in, declaring their Friday protest a day of dignity and demanding the release of the boys and the resignation of the governor of Daraa. This time, security forces at the mosque did more than fire tear gas. They opened fire on the protesters, killing at least 4 people. These were the first fatalities in a war that would go on to kill an estimated 500,000 and force half the country from their homes. Over 5.6 million Syrians became refugees abroad, the almost 6.6 million displaced in the country. Much of Daraa's population would eventually be driven from their homes, while schools, homes, and hospitals would be reduced to rubble. Reports of the use of force against peaceful demonstrators in Daraa made international news, and the response from the global community was swift. At the United Nations in New York, Secretary General Ban Ki-moon issued a statement through his spokesperson stating that the use of lethal force against protesters was unacceptable, and urging the Syrian authorities to refrain from violence and to abide by their international commitments regarding human rights, which guaranteed the freedom of opinion and expression, including the freedom of the press and right to peaceful assembly. So that's saying that the United States is starting to intervene because Syria had signed a contract with the United Nations, which is basically a group of countries who are trying to protect people all over the world. And the United States is saying, you have to stop killing people who are peacefully protesting. It doesn't make any sense. The Secretary General said he believed that it was the responsibility of the government in Syria to listen to the legitimate aspirations of the people and address them through inclusive political dialogue and genuine reforms, not repression. The Syrian government, however, had a different version of events. According to Syria's state news agency, SANA, infiltrators took advantage of gathering of citizens near the Amari Mosque in the city of Daraa on Friday afternoon to provoke chaos through acts of violence, which resulted in damage of private and public property. SANA claimed that the infiltrators had set cars and shops on fire and attacked security forces. So Syria's government made up lies that the citizens were being chaotic when really they weren't. Despite the government's violent reactions, demonstrations continued to spread across Syria, as furious citizens demanded reform. On Mother's Day in Syria, which falls on March 21st, SANA ran a story that quoted a source in the Assad administration, stating that a committee had been formed to investigate the violent clashes in Daraa, that they had decided to release a number of the young men. The boys from Daraa were given back their clothes and backpacks and taken back to their home. Released in the Al-Sariya Square to a crowd of thousands of cheering demonstrators, But the excitement soon turned to horror as it became clear that some of the boys, as young as 12, had been tortured. Their backs revealed gaping wounds left by electrical cables that the guards had used as whips. The boys had cigarette burns on their faces, and some of their fingernails were missing. Word of the boys' conditions fueled even greater anger. Even in the regime known for suppressing dissent, the torture of children was unthinkable. The boys of Daraa became icons of the budding revolution, and the protests grew. The government hoped the release of the boys would quell the movement. They sent a senior envoy on behalf of the president's office to speak to crowds of protesters. He reminded the crowds that the president had set the young prisoners free and that he should be aware of the protesters' demands. The envoy also said that the question of who had investigated the violence that erupted the following arrests were being investigated, but it was believed that the perpetrators were people impersonating security forces. He added that President Assad was sending personal representatives to the families of the dead protesters to offer his condolences. These gestures satisfied no one, as the protesters raged on, and the government accused demonstrators of ignoring these actions in an attempt to overthrow the state. Security forces started entering the city in large numbers. In state media, newscasts, demonstrators were charged with being linked to terrorists. Blame was placed on outlaws, such as President Assad's estranged cousin, Ribal Rifat al-Assad, who was exiled from Syria as a child and who became a vocal critic of the government, or Abdul Halim Kamad, an opposition ex-vice president who had turned on the government in 2005, defected to France, and called for regime change. Assad also claimed that foreign elements were trying to destroy the country. That Mother's Day, Dawa's world had changed forever. Every year, as a family tradition, she, her mother, sisters, and little brother would visit their grandfather for lunch and visit the cemetery to read the Al-Fatiha, the first chapter of the Quran, over her grandmother's grave, an important ritual for Dawa. After reading the Al-Fatiha, the children would hand out cookies filled with dates, the single flowers from their bouquet to the other cemetery visitors, receiving similar small gifts in return. On that particular day, Hana's instinct was to stay home. Outside the door of their home, the street was usually bustling with passerbyers and shoppers, was now eerily silent. There was talks of snipers, checkpoints, and clashes between demonstrators and government forces. To get to her father's house, Hana and her children would have to venture into the city center, where the clashes were at their fiercest. On top of all of this, Shakri was at work and could not accompany them until much later in the day. However, Dawa wouldn't hear of staying home. She loved visiting her grandfather's old house and budding garden, where she would play with her younger cousins. At least 30 of her family members were expected to be there, an occasion she didn't want to miss. "Mama," she insisted, "we go every year. We can't stop going." Hana eventually gave in, knowing that if she didn't take her, Dawa would probably attempt to go on her own, leaving her at home worrying. Throughout the unrest in Syria, Hana wanted to give her daughters and Hamoudi a sense of normalcy. However, Hamoudi, that's the nickname for her youngest brother, Muhammad. However, nothing about their journey awaited them would be normal. Hana decided that the safest way to get to her father was to go by taxi. Dressed in their best clothes and carefully carrying boxes that held chocolate cake and assorted cookies, they set out. At first, Hana's fears seemed unfounded. She walked to the door with Dawa, Saja, Nawara, and Hamadi, and looked out onto the street of Al-Kashaf. Fewer people than usual were out, but the shops were still serving customers and people were going about their business. Dawa spotted the usual gathering of neighbors in a shady square. The popular Abu Yusuf falafel shop had its regular line of people waiting to order at the corner store, where Dawa and her sisters, bought sweets and chips. Sweets and chips had its door wide open. For a moment, the family forgot that violence was sweeping through their city and upsetting the peace of their lives. Doa strolled down the street, smiling at the thought of visiting her grandmother's grave and spending a day with her family. It was only a 15-minute ride to Doa's grandfather's house. Normally, taxis were abundant and cheap, 35 Syrian pounds to ride to the city center. But that day, the few cars that drove by had their windows up and wouldn't slow to Hannah's waving arms. Finally, a taxi stopped and the driver rolled down his window to tell the price. 250 pounds. It was a 600 price markup. 600% markup. He said this was his risk fee. Doa was appalled that the driver would charge so much. But if they wanted to get to her grandfather's, they would have no choice but to pay the driver's price. They piled into the taxi, careful not to crush the cake or wrinkle their goods. Doa caught sight of herself in the side mirror and smoothed her brightly patterned veil, wanting to look her best for the celebration. The young driver was extremely nervous, breathing hard and constantly looking over his shoulder. As they made their way through the militarized zones of Daraa, they heard gunshots, making the driver jerk in his seat and Doa think that perhaps her mother's fears were not unfounded. At every turn, they were stopped at a military roadblock. The driver tried to get around them by taking back roads and promised to take the family as close as he could to their destination. As they neared the city center, Doa spotted dark gray smoke rising a block away. They turned the corner and saw a police station was on fire. Flames bloomed over its roof and shot violently out of the windows. The smell of smoke began to fill the taxi, burning Doa's throat. Police officers ran from the building to escape the flames, and the driver slammed on the brakes. "The protesters set it on fire!" he shouted as the car screeched to a halt. But Doa could hardly hear him over the roaring of the fire and the shouts of the people on the street. Scanning the scene through the windshield, she suddenly saw through the smoke protesters throwing rocks and shouting at the fleeing police. She pressed against the window, trying to get a clear view of what was happening. "Oh my gosh, this is terrible. Everything is going to break loose now." The fear of the driver's voice terrified Doa. "I'm sorry, but you have to get out. Keep close to the walls or they will shoot you." Doa could not believe what she was hearing. This driver was going to leave them in the middle of this chaos? And why would their own government shoot her as she was just for being on the street? Reluctantly, Hannah paid the driver and the family got out. Hannah kept Hamadi close while the girls clustered together. The heat from the fire pressed against them as they began to walk fast as they could away from it. Looking around warily, Doa's heart raced as she realized that her mother had been right. Things were unraveling. The demonstrators they saw were no longer carrying olive branches and throwing stones. Now they were setting fires. And the security forces were fighting back with water cannons, tear gas, and live artillery. And Doa's family was right in the middle of it. She was the only one. She was the one who had insisted they go. She was the reason her family was in danger. With the crackling sound of gunfire erupting nearby, Hannah grabbed Hamadi's hand and they all ran, heads down to the closest building. Feeling exposed, they pressed against the wall as billets ricocheted above their heads. They couldn't see where the bullets were coming from and weren't sure how to avoid them. Doa's mind couldn't process that people were shooting at her. Part of her couldn't believe what was happening around her, how her quiet, normal life had so turned in an instant that her family were now huddled together in fear as bullets flew through the air and fires raged through the streets. Another part of her was coolly thinking up a plan of how she could protect her family. She knew that they had to keep moving. Going back home was just as dangerous as going forward, so they decided to press on toward grandfather's house. At one point, they dropped to their hands and knees and crawled through the streets. "Keep close to the wall," Doa called to her siblings ahead of her. Hamadi and Noara started crying. Doa ignored the sour taste of fear in her mouth as she tried to comfort them. "Don't be afraid. Get up now and run." She knew that if they were panicked, they were more likely to be killed. The family ditched the cake, stood up, and moved carefully along the walls, retreating to alleyways before moving farther down the road. A walk that should have taken 10 minutes took them an hour. Finally, they reached the house of Abbasia, the neighborhood, and frantically banged on the door. Doa's uncle opened it and pulled them into the house. His face was pale with worry at the sight of the family in the midst of gunfire. "Are you crazy?" he shouted at Hannah when he pulled them into safety. "Didn't you know what it's like outside?" Saja, Nawara, and Hamadi were in shock. They quickly retreated to the back of the house, away from the sounds of shelling and death, trembling with fear. Doa, however, felt that she had to know what was happening. Minutes after she greeted her relatives, she dropped a bag of cookies on the table and ran up the stairs to the roof, knowing that from there she would have a great view of the square where they'd seen the clashes. Hannah shouted after her not to go, but Doa ignored her. She pounded the rest of the way up the steps, shoved open the door, and ran to the chest-high wall surrounding the roof's edge. Breathing hard, she peered over the wall to the square in front of her grandfather's house. Throughout her childhood, Doa had spent hours on that roof, watching the quiet plaza surrounded by shops and homes. She scanned the neighborhood now, transfixed by the protesters who had amassed on the square and were chanting, "We want freedom," as they marched with signs and olive branches towards a line of black-clad security men. Unlike the protests a few blocks away, this demonstration in the square of her grandfather's home was peaceful. The protesters were a mere 500 meters from Doa's position. She had the perfect vantage point to watch the demonstration unfold. Protesters stood in the lines and were walking slowly forward across the square when security forces began firing tear gas at them. The metal canisters flew through the air, striking some protesters before falling to the ground and spewing gas. Some people fled while others continued marching and chanting, "No to the emergency law," and "The Syrian people won't be humiliated." Many dropped to their knees, rubbing their stinging eyes as tear gas choked their breathing. Then, to Doa's horror, she saw the officers raising their rifles and shooting live ammunition directly into the crowd. She heard herself shout, "Dear God," before a wave of tear gas reached her mouth and seared her throat. The chemicals burned her eyes and she started coughing uncontrollably. She began to feel faint as she gripped the edge of the roof's wall and watched people fall to the ground, some wounded, some not moving at all. Even from a distance, Doa was certain that they were dead, and she began sobbing at the brutality of their death. The government she had grown up wanting to serve as a policewoman was now shooting its own people, and people from her grandfather's neighborhood. She realized that everything she'd grown up believing about her country was wrong. "Get down here!" Doa could hear her mother's panicked shouts from the top of the stairs. Half blinded by smoke and tears, Doa ran back to the stairway. The moment she reached the bottom of the stairs, she collapsed into her mother's arms, gasping from the tear gas and trembling in shock. It was the first time Doa had seen someone die in front of her, and she hated that she could do nothing about it. She was a powerless bystander. Eyes watering, Doa and her mother felt their way down the stairs and into the house. They retreated into a bedroom to recover and to try to make sense of what Doa had seen. After some minutes, her grandfather coaxed her out. He wanted to maintain the rituals of their Mother's Day meal, and the family began eating in a hushed and heavy silence. But when Doa drew the fork to her mouth, queasiness overtook her, and she felt she left her plate, filled with her favorite foods, untouched. Shakri burst through the door just as they were about to eat dessert. He joined them for coffee and sweets, but announced that he would be leaving before dark. Although the shooting was over and the protesters had retreated, the atmosphere outside was tense. "We can visit grandmother's grave another day." This time, Doa didn't argue. When they left the house, huddled close together, they saw bloodstains on the pavement where the shooting had taken place. The streets were deserted, save for a few men who were carrying the wounded into cars to take them away. Everyone's eyes started to burn, and water from tear gas that lingered invisibly in the air. Shakri led the family to a busy adjacent street and seemed unaffected by the uprising of violence that had taken place only a block away. Hailed a cab to take his family home. Later they found out that the demonstrators that had also set fire to the Bahath party headquarters, and the courthouse. Two branches of the Syriatel, the phone company owned by a billionaire cousin of the president, had been targeted as well. 15 demonstrators were killed that day, according to eyewitness accounts, and scores injured. The government in Damascus, hoping to contain further unrest, announced that it would investigate the deaths, but immediately began placing blame on local officials in Daraa. After that, the protests only grew in size, and more clashes occurred between demonstrators and police. It seems like every action that the government takes just makes the people more and more angry because their actions just reinforce why they're having protests to begin with. In reaction to the government's brutality, a wing of armed opposition began to emerge from the peaceful protest movement. Soon after the Mother's Day incident, Hannah joined her sister on a visit to a friend of theirs, the mother of 14-year-old Ahmed, one of the boys who had been arrested. When Hannah returned home, she was shaken and tearful. Ahmed was thin and gaunt, a ghost of his former self. We almost didn't recognize him when he came home, his mother had told Hannah. When she'd met the boy, he had sat motionless, staring into space, unable to answer when they spoke to him. His face was covered in red shiny wounds, and his arms were blotched with bruises. Not only that, his knuckles were cut open and his fingernails were missing. His mother explained that his hands had been beaten with cables as a punishment for the graffiti. As word of the boy's mistreatment and abuse while in prison spread, the death toll of protesters continued to climb. More and more people joined the weekly protests at the mosque, and demonstrators began to add to their original demands of ending corruption and emergency law. They were now calling for regime change. The protests were growing quickly in size and frequency, and more soldiers started pouring in from Damascus to subdue the movement. Doa heard that women were being encouraged to take part in the demonstrations. After what she'd seen on her grandfather's roof and hearing Ahmad's bruises and beaten body from her mother, she was eager to join. Something in her shifted. The shy girl who was once fearful of change felt driven to be part of the revolution. One of the demonstrations took place at her neighborhood, and many people from the countryside and surrounding areas came to participate. The atmosphere was jubilant. The people of Daraa started to believe that they could make a real difference in their country. When Daraa heard shouts of the demonstrators approaching her house, when Doa heard shouts of the demonstrators approaching her house, she rounded up her sisters and her brother Hamadi and her friends Amal and Hoda and joined a row of women and other girls in the back of the crowd. Doa was exhilarated. For the first time in her life, she felt a sense of larger purpose. She was determined to play a part in what she hoped would be a movement of peaceful change in the country she once loved. The more demonstrations she attended, the bolder Doa grew, and she found different ways to contribute to the cause. One of her roles at a protest was to help people who had been exposed to tear gas by squeezing lemon onto a cloth that they could place over irritated eyes, and by cutting onions in half to provoke tears that would wash away the chemicals. One of her most dangerous tasks was to pick up tear gas canisters and throw them back at the security forces. The hot canisters burned her hands, and she risked a full face of tear gas if the canister went off while she was holding it. She also ran the risk of attracting attention from the security forces, but she didn't care. She now wholly committed to the revolution, and her friends were beginning to get involved as well. The protests eventually became social events where young people would gather to share their hopes for the future. Amal and Hoda would often join Doa and her sisters after school and on the weekends at protests, whenever their mothers allowed it. But most of Doa's friends were confined to their homes and would wait anxiously for her to tell them what happened at each gathering. Doa's conversations with her friends were no longer about boys, marriage, or neighborhood gossip. Now they were only about resistance and rebellion. At night, Doa no longer watched TV, but rather spent her free time thinking about inspiring rally cries and slogans to print on signs that she would bring to demonstrations for others to carry. She also began making bracelets and rings out of beads that were the color of the revolutionary flag, red, black, and green. Each took several hours to make, and when she ran out of beads, she had to beg her father to buy her more. Shakri refused at first, worried Doa was risking her safety, making the revolutionary-themed jewelry. But in the end, as most always, he gave in to her. Doa wore the bracelets on both wrists and gave them out to friends, telling them to hide the jewelry under their sleeves when security forces made their rounds. She knew it was risky to be caught with jewelry, but she was determined to contribute to the cause in any way that she could. Her mother was paranoid that someone might find out that Doa was making these little symbols of rebellion and feared that Doa might be arrested. So Hannah took to hiding Doa's materials when she was out. But Doa would eventually find them and would go back to work on her jewelry at night while her parents were asleep. So we're going to stop this chapter there for now, but this is a great chapter for world connections. And we talk a lot about the different kinds of connections: text to self, text to text, text to media, text to world. Something unpredicted has happened in her country and flipped her whole life upside down. We can all identify with that connection because a pandemic has come and hit our country and flipped our whole world upside down. So I want you to think about the connection that you can make to this book, how your life flipped upside down. And I've also attached some pieces of media from this time in history about the Arab Spring.